Okay, so I'm still following up this discussion that's been going on my channel the last couple of days, and I'm going to see if I can't wrap up as much as I can here anyway. This, from my perspective, the overall just misguided literalism that pervades the entire debate. And again, the literalism is coming from both sides. It's obvious on the dogmatic religious side where people are, doing the virgin birth and the life after death and the miracle kind of stuff. But it's also in the, I guess, rebuttal of the naturalist position to the extent that it tries to see religion as nothing but primitive science. And I guess I'm going to see if I can't qualify and give a little bit more nuance to the two discussions I gave. And I had tried to suggest, and I tried to give as much evidence as I could there, of why I think that it's a wrong claim to suggest that religion is basically early science, pre-science, primitive science, and that as science develops, people were able to abandon religion. Now, I could see a certain way that this could come round about, but it has to do with a certain understanding of what it means to be a person and how a person relates to everything else. How is personhood the very disclosure of the world, but also an ongoing relationship both to oneself in terms of one's past and one's possibilities, in terms of the larger world, and ultimately in terms of the cosmic mystery of what all this is, and how does a person have some kind of relationship to that, whether it's explicitly addressed and meditated upon or just nascently embedded within their life and their practices. Okay, the way that I want to do this is to say that I think there is a way that one might make the claim that religion and psychology are forms of the same thing, and it would be the claim that, it would be the claim that psychology is the science that religion best preceded or most likely preceded. That when you look at ancient texts, the Bible in particular, but lots of ancient religious texts, they're metaphorical, allegorical statements from largely unconscious, but the dawning of conscious awareness as it's grappling with itself and trying to get itself at arm's distance, and almost with a mirror of reflection being the allegories and the stories that people were telling themselves. They were pre-runners to forms of psychology and forms of dealing with the problem of self-awareness that was coming in an organism who was largely having its instinctual, non-conscious life eroded. That is, to the extent that instinctual, non-thematic self-awareness, to the extent that how do you say, becomes more and more complicated in the human being, that there's an erosion of instincts and an increasing degree of feeling oneself as awkward in existence, somehow out of a lost, invisible kind of installment. I think this happens on different levels and different planes, but I think the more general point is that the kind of evidence that people were using, early peoples, to verify their religious beliefs, they weren't, and again, see, some of the text, it was difficult. Some of the texts were making claims that were something like pre-runners to contemporary physics or astrophysics or even biology and things like this. But I think the parts of the religious texts that gave them sticking power, staying power, the mass appeal that they now have, the kind of entrenchment in the culture, was the degree to which that it was a kind of psychological advice in metaphorical and allegorical guise. And it had to do with an early, an early people, different early peoples, but in the Bible, the early people's dawning of the problem of self-awareness as it was infecting the individual through the individual's life journey. That is, as tribalism and tribal life started to erode and started to wane, and the spiritual significance of the individual's life journey took on a greater and greater prominence, monotheism, and in particular the Christian monotheistic proselytizing the God of dispersion, who isn't the God of a people, but is the promise of the good news to be spread everywhere, right? It's a kind of symptom of the rise of individualism that was setting in through literacy and money. I mean, there's all these kinds of social factors and historical communication factors that are bearing upon the emergence of a new psychology being born, developed, shaped. And I think the reason I'm stressing this is that there were so many discussions in the Magic Sandwich show about the Matrix and the kind of skepticism that comes along with the Matrix. And I have posted another video on that. I'm going to post that down below, on the difference between Shrek and the Matrix, and why I think Shrek is a superior movie and the Matrix is a crypto-Christian movie. I think it was very interesting that they kept appealing to the Matrix, that the Matrix movie made real good sense to both the atheist group and the Christian group. I think because the Matrix movie is basically crypto-Christianity, and it's this promise of being super powerful and of having a connection being greater than one imagined. You know, it's sort of like heaven on earth here brought about by technology or something like this. Whereas, how do I say it, that Shrek is a disclosure of, how do I say it, the truth of our humble lot, and of the beauty of being able to accept that, of learning that overdrawn expectations that you had in your youth were the trouble, but not life. You know, most people when they're young, they fall in love with the idea of love, and then they run around looking for someone to project that onto someone else. But just because so many young people have bankrupt notions of love and then they just do all that, doesn't mean that there isn't possibility of a robust notion of love. It has to do with a mature acceptance of imperfections, of flaws, and of the beauty of life despite all that. It's to be able to see through the overdrawn expectations for, you know, the way that, and this is Suzanne Langer's line, you know, the way that we confide in one another and offer up our mud pies to one another for their sympathetic consideration. You know, I mean, we engage with others in ways that are humble, and yet, if seen on their own terms, they can be very beautiful. It's when we have overdrawn expectations that we miss it. And I think a lot of this comes from a pervasive literalism. Okay, so let me see if I can explain this even more. When I say that if religion is a kind of pre-science, it was pre-psychology, and that even today there are forms of spirituality, and I was, you know, I understand people's concern about organized religion. I share a lot of those, especially all the dogma that comes with it, and the abuses of power and evasions of accountability. I mean, there are a lot of legitimate concerns, but the kind of psychological advice that comes from spirituality seems so different than today's reductive, inside the brain is the problem kind of scientific psychology. And see, I'm going to try to explain this even more here a little bit. And, you know, okay, let's go back to some religious texts. Okay, so when the Bible has the, you know, the Adam and Eve story, okay, so Adam and Eve are there, and God says, don't eat from the tree. And what do? They eat from the tree. Now, the tree is the tree of Logos. It's the tree of the knowledge of opposites. It's basically the dawning of self-awareness. For Terence McKenna, it's, you know, mushrooms in a cow patty. But the point is that whatever it was, these early peoples are using this allegorical tale of a garden and of a fruit and of some relationship with the divinity in order to give themselves, with the text and with the story, a kind of distance to try to grasp their own self-consciousness as it's evolving. And so when you look at the story, right, so what happens? God tells them not to eat from the tree. They do. And then once they do, their eyes are uncovered. They realize their difference from one another. They realize they're naked. They feel embarrassment and shame. They hide. Well, these are descriptions of some of the changeovers of consciousness that occur with self-awareness. I mean, why aren't animals running around embarrassed, and why aren't they trying to hide their genitalia? I mean, I think these are earliest peoples trying to describe what that means to say that the organism became embarrassed of its own nakedness. It was a register of that. And there's lots of other ones that aren't so. And now again, this for a person who tries to say, well, this is an origin of it, and it's trying to give it in a literal way. Yeah, well, we could try to haggle about that, and people could try to say, well, where is the garden? And they're going to look for the fruit and this kind of stuff. To me, that's just so absurd. But to even get into the literalist argument, it's to completely miss it. I mean, the question is, can we understand how early peoples were trying to account for what it was that was happening to them as memory and language and self-awareness were all conspiring to create this notion of a world that could be investigated, that had regularities and a sense of self that was permanent across the endless coming and going and the changing of the seasons. And what is regret and remorse? What are forgiveness? What are possibilities of self-legislation and governance through navigating to a future? All of these things are happening. And when you take a biblical story, or just a quick little parable, whether it's the sin of Accidity of the 10 gold pieces, the 5 gold pieces, and the 1,000, or the 10,000, the 5,000, 1,000 gold pieces, or if you look at the claim that it's easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven. I don't think we want to go, well, metaphysically, is that true? Let's see how big the needle have to be and how much does the camel weigh. I mean, these are stories, and I don't think, from my perspective, that they're talking about an actual afterlife. They're talking about heaven as peace of mind. They're saying, look, in a time when self-awareness sets in and values are increasingly drifting from I'm hungry and I'm tired to how do I feel about feeling better than my neighbor because I have accumulated more goods, these abstract notions of value and self-esteem that come in. See, a lot of this has to do with the emergence of self-esteem as organisms become self-aware. The more that organisms deal with their own self-awareness and the more that they lose their instinctual just sort of installment in the world, the more that they mediate their relationship to others with some sense of self-worth. Or it's sometimes called reality confidence. I mean, a self-aware organism needs reality confidence or a sense of self-worth, or action just bogs down. So there's lots of biological science. You look at the work of Ernest Becker, there's a lot of contemporary psychology that helps to support part of how this evolutionarily is shaking out. But the way that it's played out in the contemporary science world, now let's get it. And I think the problem is it's ambiguous. Okay, I've tried to say this from the very get-go. This is very ambiguous, and I would love for people to maybe resonate with this or to respond to some of this. But okay, let's take something like depression, okay, or anxiety. Now there are lots of different reasons for different kinds of depression. And we need to look at it as an individual, case by case. And I don't think we want to say that, that there aren't cases of depression which really just require medical treatment, that there's something wrong and it is a brain chemistry issue and this person needs treatment. But I don't think every case of depression is that. I think there are some cases of depression which are best understood as existential crises. This is why logotherapy, forms of existential psychoanalysis, people like Viktor Frankl, some of Sartre's work, the way that the phenomenologists have tried to deal with the problem of being in the world, they've said that a person is a clearing of care and a set of engagements with the world, and that sometimes we get depressed when we know we're letting ourselves down, when we can feel something in the world that calls for us to respond to it, to do something, and we, in a moment of either self-gratification, pandering to a too immediate self, or for whatever reason, I think a person can sell themselves short and then later regret it. In the same way that a person can feel a little bit of anxiety, face a challenge, and then feel good over having faced a challenge. Now, the ambiguity comes in of how do we know whether someone's depression comes from, and it could be a host of things. It could be, quotes, just neurochemical, and that's the basis of the problem. That's the actual cause of it. Other times we could say, well, yeah, there is a kind of shortage or there's a chemical imbalance, but that's a symptom of habituated practices of having failed to meet one's sense of obligations. Now, it could be that it has to do with social environmental impact, and that there really does come kinds of neurophysiological consequences of large-scale anonymity, of the loss of meaningful work. I mean, you could look at even someone like the early Marx, where he's giving arguments about the meaningfulness of praxis and the importance of workers to be able to feel worker pride that comes from actually engaging in producing an object, right? This is very different than, Taylorism, scientific management, and the way that people were just reduced to cogs in a machine. And some people would say that this had psychological effects on people. Now, when you start to look at psychology in larger frames, I think it moves toward what these earlier religions were doing. But if by psychology what we mean is everything really just comes down to the brain, if there's something wrong that was caused in the brain, and all you need to do is give that person a pill or somehow fix the neurophysiology, then I think science and religion are at war. But if we want to say that science, or psychology and religion, but if we want to say that psychology really, some parts of psychology need to move toward an understanding of the person as a clearing of time, as an opening of future possibilities, and of a self-relationship to past, and of different forms of felt obligation to others, both anonymous others and others in one's immediate family, and all the kinds of qualitative evaluations that relate to how is to one feel about excessive greed, how is one to feel about excessive self-indulgence. I mean, there are certain aspects of how one relates to items of the larger world, and those, if they are psychology, and we're going to call those a modern science, I think those are probably the closest to what the earlier religious understandings were sort of after. They were interested in the person not as a bundle of neurophysiological chemicals, or they weren't sort of reducing the person down to something inside the body. They recognized the person as caught within ultimate crises of meaningfulness, of what is the meaning of their own life? Are they relevant? How are they relevant? How can they bring their own talents, their own unique abilities to the world and have that be appreciated? Are they valued at all? And how so? These kinds of things are, the promise of a God who loves you no matter what, I think we could all see serves some pretty vital psychological functions. Now, if somebody wants to say, well, if some person is deluded, well, that's a problem. Okay, I think that that's right, but here is maybe where I'd want to end. Okay, if some person has been so damaged and screwed up by the world's hardships and the world's countless injustices, and now they need some form of religion in order to make their life better. And it is qualitatively better because of the religious beliefs. I say that I'm all for it. And in the same way, if some person has had religion and religious institutions and religious dogma so screw them up and bring pain and suffering, injustice and hardship to their lives that now they need atheism, because atheism, it gives them more peace of mind, it makes more sense, everything, and it makes their life better, then I'm all for it. But if either group simply want to sit at the table and have a literal fact of the matter argument over which one's really truth, I think both people have gone mad. All right, thank you.